Good evening, everyone. It's really glad to be back with you again. And tonight I'm speaking to a very good friend and someone that I haven't spoken to on recording for some time, actually, although we're always in contact about all the craziness in the world at the moment and all the historical context. And there's very few people better than Matt Ehret to explain what's going on. Good evening, Matt, or good afternoon in your case.
Good evening to you. Good afternoon to me. Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Vanessa. I always look forward to our little chats.
Well, tonight I wanted to talk to you about the Fabian Society because we have a new old government in the UK under the leadership of Keir Starmer, who's nothing more than a hand puppet of Tony Blair, who of course now sees his opportunity to retake power in the UK, and of course who is one of the most arch members of the Fabian Society. And actually the Fabian Society put out a, I have to say, post on X, because I still call them tweets, claiming that they have 141 Fabian Society members. Now, of course, under the Blair leadership, there were, I think, around 200. So it's actually dropped off a little bit in the kind of new Labour. Can you just perhaps give people a little bit of the history of the Fabian Society that I noted was formed actually not long before the Zionist movement was formed, so in the late 1800s?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a little bit of this historic coloring is pretty important to give people a sense of the topography and what's shaping the environment that they're moving through. And often we tend to get a little bit mired in the details and the commentaries of the day regarding the ever fluctuating geopolitical sort of environment that we forget about. Well, what is the context setting this? Why is this all happening? What does it mean that there has been a Fabian upsurge inside of the British government? So I think that this little conversation will be hopefully useful for some of the viewers to just appreciate that a little bit, and hopefully in so doing, I think I want people to appreciate the weak spots, where are the kinks in the armor, where are the kinks in the machinery. Which one could only see by taking sort of a step back and seeing why did the Fabian Society come into being in the first place? Why was there a perceived decision made to create it? What was the need being satisfied within the higher echelons of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, such that they felt the requirement to bring such a thing as I guess you could call it a proto think tank into existence. And of course it's a vastly influential, the influence of the Fabians cannot be underestimated. Obviously, the Labour Party itself was a party that grew out of this think tank in 1900 or so, 1901, and its constitution was written by a Fabian Society founder and ideologue, Sidney Webb, who was a leading, they call themselves socialists. But I think that there's a certain species of socialism that they were really, really advocating, since the vast majority, whether it was, Beatrice or Sidney Webb, his wife, who were leading members, or George Bernard Shaw, or if you look at the rogues gallery of some of the leading members over the years, Halford Mackinder was a member, Leo Amory became a member. You had Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells. There was many people. When you look at their writings and you look at what they were committed to, they were deep what's the word? Misanthropists.
Yeah.
Many of them tended towards or leaned very heavily towards eugenicists. So they weren't the sorts of champions of labor and the poor that one would expect, considering they all seem to despise the poor, and they seem to despise even humanity more broadly, as far as their desire to have a scientific management of society run by a managerial elite that would promote a form of socialism, which I think when you look at people like Lord Milner as well, who is a frequent discussion member of this group, there's another think tank created by Beatrice and Sidney Webb called the Coefficients Club, which Milner was an enthusiastic member of. So was Harold Lasky for a period. um, they were pushing this new innovation of social imperialism. So the idea was,
Well,
the empire,
feudalism, basically, isn't it? I mean, it's a form of
in its essence,
feudalism.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. The idea was, the empire was a little bit too, it extended itself a little bit too abusively, and they had to come into a recognition that over the century prior, and maybe 2 centuries perhaps even prior, the British Empire became a little bit too big for its britches, too abusive of the slaves, whether it was in India or whether it was in any part of the realm. The British Empire was a globally extended world government for all intents and purposes that operated above governments through the banking sector, through things like the City of London, through paramilitary groups that were arranged and overseen by the British East India Company that had their own sort of separate form of governance in many ways that interfaced with the revolving door into the official realm of government of the British Empire. But it was never an empire of a nation or an extension of a nation, as we've often been told. It was this other entity. It was above nations, and they oversaw, as far as maintaining their ideal of stasis and obedience. There was a general philosophy of break the savages, impose the will of the strong onto the weak, control famines. The logic of Malthus, as far as scientific management was concerned, was a big part of the administration of the global empire. So there needed to be, according to the Malthusian laws of population control, certain mandatory famines that would be maintained in India, or we saw it aggressively played out in Ireland with a form of controlled genocide there, a famine that the Irish were told was a potato blight, a potato famine, but it was never the case. It was always a controlled genocide. It's like the Irish produced a lot of things other than potatoes. And there's British soldiers across Ireland overseeing the extraction of the food that was being produced so that the Irish themselves wouldn't eat it, and it would go towards maintaining the global British Empire. And we saw this again and again. But it of course, this level of abuse created a pressure cooker, which made things rather unstable. We saw many uprisings in India. A lot of those who were expected to act like obedient feudal serfs were not acting that way when their lives were so clearly being abused and threatened. So you'd get all sorts of rebellions across the empire. So I think the empire was sort of falling apart, especially by the end of the 19th century. Nation states, there's a recognition by many leaders of Asia, of Russia, of even in Europe. Sidi Carnot was a president of France, a major industrialist. Otto von Bismarck had his Humboldtian networks in Germany that had just recently been unified around certain principles of economics and national economics that had proven themselves to work very well when they were done first in the United States under protective tariffs. This is the basis of the German Zollverein, was modeled on what Hamilton had done under the colonies to unify the colonies into becoming a viable nation with a national bank and directed credit towards big projects that were very, very advanced as far as building railroads, canal systems that were big and that allowed for nations to utilize national sovereign power to take their destiny into their own hands. The American population had expanded quite a bit. I think the population quadrupled in the first 40 years based on these policies, despite them being often done quite sloppily. But in principle, it demonstrated that the sovereign nation state could exert an influence over the private banking sector in the benefit and in accordance with some idea of some moral law that was associated with the welfare of the people, which allowed for the overcoming of the limits to growth logic of the Malthusians. And so this was done so well under especially Lincoln, who was able to maintain the Union despite a lot of support by the British Empire to break up America during the 1861 to 65 period. That nations who had supported America in that fight, I'm thinking here primarily of Russia, which intervened directly under Alexander II to support the Union. Alexander II adopted many of Lincoln's policies immediately after the Civil War, even after Lincoln was dead, to build the Trans-Siberian Railway, apply protective tariffs to Russia. State banks were created by Sergei Witte, the finance minister, and American U.S.-Russian relations were really healthy at that time. And you had similar people in China in the 1890s adopting and applying this principle under the 100 Days Reform of 1894, which was subverted to extend rail from Russia down into China and up through the Bering Strait into Alaska that had just been sold to the Americans in 1867. So you had this idea that nations could liberate themselves from British control of sea power. The maritime controls of choke points was how the British empire was able to exert its influence over the world. You don't have to control everything. You just have to control 12 or 13 global choke points on the seas and keep everybody addicted to sea power. Mm. And that was slipping away from the empire as nations were developing their inland territories, developing industrial corridors, new networks of education were blossoming, new inventions were happening as people were solving big problems, engineering problems that were not solvable with the previous earlier primitive set of knowledge. So, and they were working together. There was an idea of cooperation as something that would supersede the age of Hobbesian geopolitics. So that I think was the crisis of empire that sets the stage by the 1870s for the decision to do some soul searching. I guess you could say, if there is a soul in the empire, they had to do a bit of crisis management and some soul searching to think like, well, what will be the future of the empire? Are we able to exist in this world where nations are breaking free and declaring their own sovereign destiny in, outside of our system of controls? So the Fabian Society was created in 1884 as a part of this, as one of several dominant think tanks. It grew out of something that was called the Fellowship of the New Life, which was set up by, I think, 12 or so figures around this Thomas Davidson character, promoting, Tolstoy's worldview, basic simplistic concepts of simple living, vegetarianism, absolute pacifism, unconditional pacifism under all circumstances, think little, think local, logic, and a lot of basically all of the founding members of the Fabians grew out of this previous organization the year earlier, and also overlapped another entity that was created in the 1770s called the Theosophists, of which there were a couple early Fabians that became Theosophists, even led the Theosophists, namely Annie Besant, who replaced Madame Blavatsky. You had Frank Podmore, another figure who is also promoting this. And so each one of these things were sort of trying to meet different aspects of the failures of the empire. You also had the Round Table movement that grew out of Lord Milner's kindergarten. That was sort of a more aggressive branch of or type of think tank that had was designed around the same time with many overlapping members throughout the years, including Milner, but many others over the years that would overlap with the Fabians. And, while the Fabians had a more socialistic sort of branding, utilizing it early on the founding documents of Marx and his manifesto, both with their American branches of the Fabian Society promoting Marx in America, but also in Britain, that satisfied or tried to appeal to labor, the poor, and essentially attract and rally groupings of impoverished plebeians into some weaponized mob that could be deployed by a higher elite that didn't really like them in the first place. And the Round Table movement was a little bit more conservative, stiff upper lip, Oxford, Balliol College, All Souls types who would be indoctrinated, sometimes with scholarships from around the empire that would then be formed, groomed within Oxford, and then resent back into whatever part of the empire that they would need to subvert on behalf of some supranational entity. And the philosophy of both the Round Table and Fabians that would work together would be based upon the idea of Fabius Maximus, the Fabius Quintus Maximus, who was a Roman patrician, a high-level oligarch of Rome. He was, I think, one of the sorcerer kings or sorcerer consuls, I guess you could say, because it was still during the Republic, during the lead up to the Punic, or during the Punic War, who developed an innovative technique of battle with Rome's enemy at the time, Hannibal, who was the leader of Carthage.
Yeah.
And his innovation was to simply avoid head-on fights, but have patience, draw out your enemy slowly by having them use up their resources, and through attrition, have them weaken until the time was ripe to strike, which is why the Fabians, one of their kind of hilarious logos that was selected, I think it was George Bernard Shaw, who, though he despised human beings a lot, it was hilarious, had a turtle
Yes.
that was designed as one of their mascots, which said something like, when we strike hard. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was sort of it. And part of their philosophy too is permeation theory. So what Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells and Mackinder, the founder of geopolitics, who managed the London School of Economics as a director for a period, which is another school that grew out directly of the Fabian Society. It was the official Fabian Society school. Bertrand Russell taught there. Many did. They put forth this idea of permeation, that the strategy of this slow attrition will be to patiently permeate instead of trying to get immediate satisfaction by crushing the savages now. Permeate slowly and even think multi-generationally, so that each person who's able to get access to a power within, whether the educational system or the military or private sector or media or official government institute corridors, will then assist the newer generations coming in to climb to positions of influence as well. And both would interface very closely with the Round Table movement at the same time. So that was a thing too.
Yeah. So basically, world government by stealth.
Yeah, pretty much.
and I guess now, you would look at it as kind of, or part of it as smart power, soft power, etc., infiltration of societies, which of course has been used very successfully to some degree by the neo-colonialists to infiltrate societies, designate opposition, or simply to, take control. Palestine after the Oslo agreements was very much invaded by and occupied by Western and Zionist-backed NGOs that effectively took control of the most important sectors of society.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a world government by stealth.
Mm-hmm.
And many of these, when I look at it, much of what has been going on is very similar to what you described, this technique of attrition, psychological warfare, manipulation. We saw that during the COVID project, for example. That I think was the most blatant example of imposing this kind of feudalist system, which, as you say, is kind of marketed and branded as socialism by the Fabians, of course. But Blair was about as far from being socialist as you can possibly get. I guess, it's some kind of communitarianism. But effectively at its heart, of course, I would go as far as saying it's fascist. You survive. In other words, they take control of food, of finances, the economy, health, education, etc. And you survive only by complying, right? So, what I find really interesting is the stage in history that the Fabians were created and the stage in history that we're now at. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why are the Fabians, did they ever go away? Were they always there kind of bubbling under? Is there now a resurgence of the Fabian movement? And if so, why at this stage in history?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's no, they certainly yeah, didn't go away, and I think that part of the way that this game has been played over the years and even centuries or longer is this controlled opposition utilizing false opposites within that express different components of the human condition. And in the simplest way I could think to express it, which I think is how the oligarchy in a simple form, there's obviously subtleties lost here, understands the operation, is that the heart and mind are two coexistent parts of the human condition, right? And one can build movements that revolve around those two principles in ways that are abusive. So coming out, for example, of looking at the analysis of Friedrich Schiller, who in the 1790s was evaluating the causes of the failure of the French Revolution, he made the observation that the problem suffered by the French, why they were incapable of actualizing those great ideals that were put forth in the 1789, tennis court oath and the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, which had a lot of similarities to what had been expressed by Benjamin Franklin's they were Benjamin Franklin's networks, frankly, but those same ideals that were put forth in the Declaration of Independence in the United States had two different outcomes, where one of them resulted in a new form of government that generally rejected hereditary forms of governance, or the idea that authority of law came through the hereditary nobility, or the idea that people are either born slaves or born masters. So that was rejected in the form of that new government, although admittedly they fell short in practice of those high ideals. But despite that, it didn't turn into a bloody terror the way we saw in France, where all of those great leaders, who often were scientists, artists, statesmen, like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the president of the mayor of Paris and the president of the Assemblée Nationale, who oversaw the drafting of the Declaration in France, they all got their heads cut off. And it didn't take too long for this thing to degrade into a bloody terror of civil war internally. 40,000 people had like inquisitional trials that resulted in heads being lopped off left and right. And basically within that bloody terror, you had the formation of the first concept in modern times, at least, of the left versus right party system. So people on one side of the Assemblée were known as the Jacobins. They were those who followed the sorts of Rousseauian philosophy extolled by people like Robespierre, and tended to be based upon the idea of we the people don't need scientists. That was one of the rallying cries of the Jacobins, was la révolution n'a pas besoin des scientistes. So of course the scientists are seen as the elite. So everybody who's the elite is bad, and we have to just create equality by cutting everyone's head off and bringing everyone to the same mediocrity of the uneducated peasants, and that was like a weaponization of the mob, of the masses. And the peasants, as Schiller notes, had a problem of not having literacy. They didn't have culture so much because of the seigneurie feudal system that was prevalent still in France. There was a big divide culturally between the aristocrats and the people, versus in America, you had a widespread literacy, what was known as the Latin farmer. So American or English colonists in the Americas were generally expected to know Latin. They could read the Bible in its original script. They could read a high English. They could read the pamphlets and thus develop a mental infrastructure for philosophical heavy ideas to be born. So they understood the ideas, the very abstract ideas of freedom, justice, why it's worth risking one's life for your soul. They could get an idea of what that meant and act accordingly. So in France, he didn't have so much of that. And also, so he, in the elites of France, he made the point that there was a problem of an over developed abstract literacy. So there was culture amongst the elites, but there wasn't a love for the people. There was not. So Schiller uses, I guess, a form of outdated language where he describes it as the barbarians versus the savages, where the mobs, the plebes, who were manipulated by these rabble rousers, didn't have they would be qualified under the savages. They didn't have minds to understand what was going on, whereas the barbarians, who were more reprehensible in Schiller's mind, because they had the culture, they had the understanding, they had the literacy, but they had a misanthropy overall that was pervasive amongst the elites. So there wasn't enough love for the people, enough ability to feel with your heart. So thus you couldn't really understand what justice was or act accordingly. And that resulted in a bloodbath, a power vacuum in which the financiers, who were always managing the city of London, who had, big penetrations into the upper crust of the oligarchical families that were in France, the Orleans, the House of, Bourbon, and other families that overlapped and intermarried, obviously, with the British or the Habsburg. A lot of these families out there, they all intermarry. So there's a certain amount of rivalry, but at the same time an agreement amongst these thieves on how to manage the system, that they could then introduce a proto-fascist Napoleon figure as a solution, a reconciliation to the crisis of these false dualisms. So I'm saying all of this with the idea of your question in my mind, which was the Fabians, and are they influential today, or how have they maintained their techniques of influence over the 140 years since they were created? And I think part of that, as I alluded to with the roundtable movement, is this acting upon the principle of the heart, where the Fabians, there's a lot of good people who are labor. I know a lot of my friends would consider themselves left labor. Some are pro Fabian, and they're good people. It doesn't mean you're bad. It just, there's something in the club that has I think a hierarchical dishonesty about it, that if you're in the inner clubs, then you know what the game is. If you're on the outer level, the exoteric sort of level, you might just be broad ideals of equality and stop injustice, blah blah, good things we should all be fighting for. But now I say this because the leading members of the Fabian Society, on the one hand, there's been a revolving door, like in Canada. Our Fabian Society in Canada is a good example to illustrate this. Was created in 1931 amidst the Great Depression, and it was called the League of Social Reconstruction. It promoted itself as the Canadian Fabian Society, and it was founded by 5 founders, of which six founders, all but one, 5 of them were Rhodes Scholars, including the handler of a young Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who himself was trained under Harold Lasky in the Fabian Society's London School of Economics in the 40s. This person's name was F.R. Scott. But these founders, some of them were radical eugenicists, were Rhodes Scholars. Then they created a political party, just kind of like the way they did using the same model in England earlier. And that political party was known as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in 1933. And the constitution of it was, again, modeled on the Labor Party model, except this one made it a bit more explicit that scientific management of society would be the ultimate goal of this thing. And of course, this was happening during the Great Depression, at a time when people were desperate for new ideas that would help them put bread and food on the table, because people were starving across the United States and Canada. So they were trying to capitalize on people's desperation and fear. Eugenics was very normalized back then as a branch of science that was being taught in Harvard and McGill and Oxford and everywhere. Everyone, to be a true scientist, and everyone was paying homage to the legitimacy of the statistical study of genetics, especially, in the form of eugenics, to weed out the unfit from society. It overlapped with the Neo-Malthusian clubs as well, the idea of managing global population, both in terms of quantity, and then eugenics was about the quality of the people. But they both were two sides of the same thing, which is why people like, what's his name? John Maynard Keynes was both a eugenicist. He was the president of the Eugenics Society, its treasurer. No, not the president. He was the treasurer of the Eugenics Society, and I think he was the vice president. At the same time as he was a member of the Neo-Malthusian League, so was Annie Besant. So were many of them. Bertrand Russell, another. And, the idea was for that to be the basis of the new system of value, and AKA fascism. Now, Hitler made that a bit of an ugly term when people saw the consequences of the real political application of what eugenics and fascism actually did versus these nice ideals of scientific management that they were sold upon. And I think Keynes gave a good example of how this game was played when there was something set up in 32 in the London School of Economics between two lecturers, Keynes being one side, who made a famous debate with a fellow by the name of Friedrich von Hayek, who was supposed to represent the total dipole opposite of Keynes, right? So von Hayek we associate with free market, Austrian school, essentially neo-anarchism, basically. You know, the idea that we don't, governments are bad, we don't need governments, everyone can self-organize and self-manage to create economic opportunities with no laws. Every time you have a government exerting any influence over the economic realm, it will always be tyrannical and evil and fascist, so no government should not exist for economics. Because it's, yeah. And then you had Keynes on the other side saying, no, we need to deal with the Great Depression by having more government centralized control. And he had his own response of creating work. And in the Keynes model, it was there was no ability to discern better, like correct, right or wrong forms of economic action, because in Keynes' world, as long as he's a mathematician first and foremost, right, Keynes. So if you could pay somebody to dig a hole and pay somebody else to fill the hole, he couldn't argue why that was not the right thing to do, because both of those people would be getting paychecks, and they would use those paychecks, as he said, to go buy things. And the act of buying things in Walmart or whatever, they didn't have Walmart, but the act of buying things was creating a demand that would then be satisfied by the creation of production that would then go into produce things that people wanted to buy. And then the act of having industrial production would demand that there be electricity or water for industrial use, that would thus create a demand for government to build infrastructure like hydroelectric dams or whatever to satisfy those higher needs. And it was he inverted reality by doing this, which was a sleight of hand, a magic trick in a sense, which was not how any type of big infrastructure ever happened. It was actually, that was a flawed idea, because the reality was the Great Depression was actually being dealt with by a revival of that same American system I had alluded to earlier on, that had been adopted by Lincoln or revived by Lincoln. It was that same system that was going global around the idea of national sovereign economic, what's called dirigism, that was spreading around the world in the 1870s, 1880s. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt had studied while he was a student. That's what he immersed himself in. That's what he revived when he came in with his solution, which was not either Fabian solution nor was it a right-wing capitalist solution. It was a national national program that was the New Deal. It involved a massive war on the city of London, where he sabotaged a London bankers conference that was supposed to be a one world government agenda conference in 1932 London or 33 London, which required the U.S. sign up and give up sovereignty to a League of Nations and Bank of England that would oversee the New World Order. He pulled the U.S. delegations out of that at the same time as he was declaring war on the Wall Street banks that created the Great Depression in the first place in the 20s by creating these false debt-based bubbles based on speculation on real estate, which could then be blown up in a controlled demolition, which was exactly what happened for wealth transfer to happen and for that crisis to be artificially induced. So he broke up the banks. He passed Glass-Steagall. He avoided a couple of assassination attempts along the way. Some of his allies, like the man he was going to make Attorney General, forgot his name, but his closest ally was killed on a train, poisoned right the day he was supposed to become the Attorney General, who was the major enemy of J. Edgar Hoover. So you had it was a fight, right? It wasn't just, this is not an abstract idea, it was battle. And people got lost. They were not paying attention to what he was doing properly because they were so caught up in this debate between Keynes versus Hayek, who were lifelong friends. They were both supporters of world government, and people who might cringe at what I just said, read Friedrich von Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and he clearly states at the last chapter that we need some form of world governing authority to ensure and impose global free trade onto the nations of the earth. So he does want top-down rules being imposed by an elite, which is, and they're lifelong friends. And they both, the Fabian Society plays a key role in driving the creation of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. And the Mont Pelerin Society is overseen by all of these like right-wing, Milton Friedman types. Milton Friedman comes through that. Karl Popper is a member who trains George Soros, Lionel Robbins and von Mises. And so you got this thing which has a lot of patronage and sponsorship by the Fabians, and even the Mont Pelerin Society admits their Fabian roots on their own websites and promotional material. But the idea was during the Cold War, that was the fraud, right? You were told you could either be, if you want to be a good Democrat or a good person on the left, a good labor, you have to be a Keynesian. And if you want to be a responsible conservative, you have to be a follower of the Austrian school of Friedrich von Hayek. And you got to pick a side of left or right. One side is very much barbarian leaning, very, very much logic based. It doesn't matter if we, well, you just talk to a free market ideologue and try to get a sense of how much love for humanity is ultimately really there. Most of the time, it's pretty lame. It's pretty low. And the same thing for the Fabians. It capitalized on people's empathy. It manipulated their empathy towards like, oh, we're killing the earth. Everything humans are doing is bad. Empire is bad. And they would pay lip service to like complaining about the abuses of empire. But then the policies being promoted were ultimately all leaning towards different forms of world government to manage and redistribute the wealth of the world according to the idea of feudalism. So they were just, it was a fraud. It was a fake choice. And people just bought it. And the Mont Pelerin Society came in heavy with Blair even. It came in with Thatcher, and it was active with Blair through his wife. There's a lot of overlap of these false left, false right zombies, very sophisticatedly, penetrating different governments around the world with the same objective.
Yeah. But so why is it so important that that they appear to be re-emerging now? Well, particularly in the UK.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Why now? I mean, when both parties became a bit of a uniparty, right? More increasingly over the years, there's this strange convergence. We have it in the United States as well, where what people thought were different parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, increasingly became convergent on the same overarching worldview. Yeah. And that wasn't so obvious in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, but it became more and more clear, especially after the age of blowing up the Middle East and creating a global security state. Why now in the case of Britain? It's a good question.
It's one that has been bugging me because everything is manipulated, in my opinion. It's no. I mean, at the end of the day, they talk about a landslide victory, but it was a 52% turnout, so that's hardly a landslide victory. The majority of the country didn't vote for Labour, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I mean, everything is so orchestrated now. I don't tend to see anything as being an organic movement or happening or event or situation. So I look at it very much is why now has basically Blair come back to power? I mean, he's had enormous influence through, or he thinks he's had enormous influence through the Blair Global Initiative, and certainly that's becoming the catch-all for all of the fairly unpleasant members of government that kind of fall off the bench but land in the Blair Global Initiative. To continue their work, so one assumes that is a higher echelon to government, right? And Blair, we know, has been developing his tentacles of power between himself and his wife, because you quite rightly mentioned Sherry Blair. And he's never really, in my view, relinquished his hold on power. I think he's actually been building it, but in the upper echelons rather than the lower echelons, because government is, in my view, let's say middle echelons. It's definitely, when we look at Western governments, they're controlled. We don't see leadership. We don't see politicians or diplomats of any gravitas or weight. We see, stenographers and script readers that are replaced when they become obsolete or when they step out of line, though very few of them do these days.
Yeah.
So, I guess my question is, look, when we look at the history of the Fabians and the juncture of history where they came to prominence or where they were established, and if we compare it to now, what is happening, are we looking at a continuation of the direction of travel, or are we looking at an opportunity now for the entire kind of one world government team to increase their grip on power, or at least they perceive it to be an opportunity for them to increase their grip on power? Or are they seeing a loss of grip on power, and so therefore they're scrabbling to maintain a foothold? Sorry,
I mean,
questions.
No, it's. I think we're both kind of like gaming it out and trying to think about this as well, because like you said, I think you nailed it. You hit the nail on the head when you made the observation that we shouldn't mistakenly have these sorts of conversations with the presumption that we're dealing with democracies or nation states. Like there's elements, residual elements that are of nation states or government that play some role in things, but in the West we've lost so much. It's at this point much more like all governments are mixtures. There's no such thing. I don't think that there's ever been in human history ever a crystallized pure monarchy or pure democracy or pure socialist state or whatever, right? Like, or pure fascism in a pure sense. There's always a mixture of elements, and sometimes it leans more towards one or the other. It's like this is where I think the whole discussion as a bit of a segue while I think about my answer, the whole discussion around like you a commie, you a capitalist, that Cold War type of dichotomy was such a fallacy, because if you look at how nation states ever actually did real big bursts of genuine, authentic progress that increased both metaphysical liberties of the people, but also physical abundance by creating new discoveries, creating conditions whereby you get these leaps over the limits of growth by encouraging new technologies through new discoveries that would transform both the educational system. Old textbooks would have to be superseded by better textbooks that were in conformity with the new discovered laws of whatever in the electromagnetic domain or nuclear domain or whatever. That was good. You got to get people naturally getting used to leaning into the unknown and getting out of our comfort zone as our comfort. Like that's the way a society becomes fit to survive and discovers its true self, is by learning to get comfortable being uncomfortable for the right reasons. Not just for, gotta keep people afraid and agitated so that they're not able to think. Not that's the divide to rule type, but for the right reasons. So as they say, as somebody said once, without a vision, the people perish. So you have to have good, objectively true goals for the future that organize your resources and priorities and create that sort of momentum. And so the reality was that Franklin Roosevelt was neither and he was neither a capitalist nor a communist in the conventional modern acceptable definitions that we're expected to fit everything into. He was a nationalist first and foremost, and that utilized social values while at the same time creating climates for businesses to flourish and private enterprise to flourish, which is why he's attacked by the communists or the socialists for being a capitalist pig, and he's attacked by the capitalists for being a socialist pig. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you guys are both like having a non-existent battle here, and they do the same thing for many. It's like, what is China today? People are like, oh, China's a communist state. It's bad. It's like, well, they got more thriving businesses and private enterprises now than the U.S. does, and they've registered more patents over the last 3 years than the U.S. has, and that's growing. So I mean, at the same time, they also have national authority to do things. So it's not But does that mean you could say, oh, but then that's like Mussolini corporatism? You had the state working private sector as corporatist fascism. It's like, well, is that the thing? Well, then the question becomes, well, what's the difference between fascism, which maybe Mussolini had both the state, they're called national socialists, so were the Nazis. But I mean, in what way, what philosophy was behind the application of their political doctrines when they actually got political power? Though they call themselves both nationalists and socialists, what were they? Well, the philosophy was rooted in a Nietzschean eugenics, neo-Darwinian view of man as being ultimately not differentiated from an animal that could be thus lorded over by the better alpha animals within the wolf pack. And if you don't qualitatively define what a human is and why a human is first, and you make the mistake of misdefining the humans in the system that you're trying to think about as being just another form of animal in the jungle, then it becomes the Nietzschean, Übermenschen, might makes right equals truth view of whatever. So everything will become then used, whether you call yourself a socialist system or a capitalist system. If that's your philosophy, it'll become fascism fast, and very quickly feudalism. Hence, imperial socialism was the Milner thing. And Milner was also working with Leo Amory and others, penetrating the Middle East. They were the ones drafting the Balfour Accords. Balfour himself was a Fabian. So they were all thinking about calibrating this to different parts of the world, to India, to the Middle East, to Latin America. All that to say, okay, so today you're dealing with an aspect of the government which I think is flailing a little bit. I think that I believe that I'm witnessing what appears to be a hecticness on the part of the Western oligarchical elite and their auxiliaries that have taken control of so much of the Five Eyes, NATO, transatlantic sort of community. And I'm noticing that in a similar way that I could see when I look at when I do historical research and I look at the 19th century and the spread of Abraham Lincoln's system of real American, not what we were given in the 20th century for the most part, but the real American system being spread and adopted and embraced under this idea of win-win cooperation as a philosophy of other nation states that actually operated with leadership that cared about their people and acted accordingly. That created a crisis in the empire, and there was a definite chaos within the echelons of the British Empire of the 1870s, especially. They had to dissolve the British East India Company and try to absorb it into British intelligence. That's when modern British intelligence was sort of brought online in a more coherent way. They had to do a whole bunch of things to try to. There was a lot of hecticness. The empire could clearly see that there was a chance of them dissolving under the new emerging system of cooperation with different cultures, very diverse cultures, recognizing a common humanity and a common self-interest that was more than just fighting over scraps of a system of diminishing returns in a world of finiteness or scarcity, which was, so that was clear. They could have lost control, and they were on the verge if they didn't kick over the chessboard. And you could just look at the amount of assassinations that had to be unleashed by British-directed anarcho-terrorist groups that killed dozens and dozens of leading statesmen from after Lincoln. I mean, it was a huge list of Alexander II. I think the third also was poisoned by, but you had Sadi Carnot, and there were many leaders killed all the way to Archduke Ferdinand and after. And then, they had to artificially induce some new French revolutionary tactics that were applied to the Russian case to destabilize the Russian government. They were trying to do this in a variety of places in China as well. They had to create a world war by creating military. I mean, they acted in this. These were not acts of confidence in control. They were acting this way because they were kicking over the chessboard with sophistication. Don't get me wrong. This was not an easy thing to do, but they did it because control was slipping away from them so clearly. And I do see that with the emergence of the the multipolar alliance and the BRICS nations, having acted the way that they've acted in the last, especially the last 12 or 13 years, have really demonstrated that diverse cultural groups could utilize national sovereignty in a way that Mackinder said was impossible. Halford Mackinder was of the belief that, people are destined to fight amongst each other forever until a Leviathan could be created. He's a Hobbesian to impose order from the top. And, neo-Mackinderites like Sir Bernard Lewis or Zbigniew Brzezinski or Samuel Huntington, you read their writings, and they're clearly following that same logic, where they concluded that unless you get a world government to impose order, then the different cultures and religions must fight each other to the death, because that's just the nature of man, is to fight. And, there's no other way to reconcile our differences. And here we have an actual practical living expression of how that all of these theories of religion and culture and human nature is false. We've got big economic projects that are uplifting people to higher standards of living, being built up through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the initiatives across Africa that are tied to the Belt and Road with the help of the Russians and the Chinese, and increasingly even nations that have been misbehaving quite a bit, like the Saudis and the UAE, who have at least had the common sense to join the BRICS, have their own fights with their own deep state operations that have been built up. But at least you see an awakening of sanity, of forms of sane economic behavior from these states towards building real infrastructure, industrial corridors, Africa and their own countries, with a lean towards the East, recognizing that the system is going to collapse in the West. Not if, but we don't know the date, but it's built to collapse.
Yeah.
So I think everyone's sort of preparing for that shockwave to really hit, and positioning themselves to be in the best possible place to come out of this with some form of influence, because things are going to get probably much, much messier before they get better. And I think the oligarchy sort of doing the same thing. They've realized, I think that they've overplayed some of their hands that they had also done in the 20s or in the 30s, when they extended themselves, thinking that they could, by creating a Great Depression, blowing out the system, that they could bring people through desperation into an acceptance of a eugenics-based technocratic world order under the Fabian Rhodes Scholar management of the League of Nations at the time. They overplayed their hand there. It was sabotaged a few times over. And they've done it again. And I think that there's a decadence that we can clearly see when we listen to some of the auxiliaries, the Jake Sullivans and the Blinkens and the Starmers, Keirs speaking, or Rishi Sunak, it's like all of the auxiliaries of the system are themselves processed through the same, decadent web of corruption and stupidification that they created as a trap for their victims. They couldn't. This has been now several generations of dumber and dumber progeny of the old guard. And the old guard, you read the writings of a Kissinger or a Zbigniew, who are both dead now, but they had intellectual rigor, They were even, but not as much as the earlier generation of H.G. Wells or Bertrand Russell or Mackinder. They had even more intellectual rigor. And each generation, it's just been subsequently weaker-minded and more decadent. And now their decadence has created, I think, an objective crisis within them. And I think they scramble. I don't think – that's my hypothesis, at least, right now. When I look at the political dynamics of Europe, there's a certain amount of control and drama and theater to the whole thing. Like they're still using their same levers, controlling the left and the right through the mind, the intellect, heart dichotomies but at the same time, they don't really have competent people who have discernment or judgment, or subtlety or suavesse, that are required if they're actually going to fight Putin and Xi Jinping and the type of qualitative matured leadership that have taken power and represent the interests of Eurasia, and increasingly the world, the 80% of the world population that wants a better way. You can't fight that thing under the current level of mediocrity. And I think that the oligarchy in their inner sanctum is vicious as sin. I think that Blair represents the sort of though I don't think he's dumb, but he's not like, he doesn't seem like a very high level intellect. He's like the sort of Benthamite Hellfire Club, hedonist. That's
Well,
how I sort of see his personality.
I think he's a good manipulator, whereas I think
Very.
the Sunaks and even Boris Johnson, who's someone who's relatively erudite in many areas, but hopeless at just putting through a policy that is not his own, basically, and that's what they're all doing. And I do wonder if effectively putting the power back in the hands of Blair, while he's not, a shining, he's certainly not Illuminati, let's put it that way, but he's got a long history of duplicitousness, political savvy, and knowledge of how to manipulate. And of course, he's kind of inveigled himself in a number of layers of the upper echelons through religion, through conversion to Catholicism. I think it was shortly after he left power.
Yeah.
So it's a career path. Let's put it that way. And I find it interesting that the kind of at this stage the ball's been very much put back in his hands.
Yeah.
So I think they've played around with the kindergarten, and I think they've decided to go back to, I don't know what it is in Canada and America, but slightly higher grade maybe of useful idiot to try and secure, to try and get them back on path, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think you're right, and in the case of all of the left parties of the world, there's been a nudging of a big faction, towards an imperial turn. We saw that with, the Democratic Party was historically the progressive party against empire under John F. Kennedy and FDR and Bobby Kennedy, and who were all, killed. And yes, I say FDR was killed too. But then by the Clinton Rhodes Scholar takeover, because Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, there was like 20 Rhodes Scholars who came into the White House with Clinton. You saw a transformation, a very clear. The transformation had already been in motion before that, but it really became more visceral, especially with the bombing of Yugoslavia in the late 90s under Clinton. And then
Blair, of course, because Blair was
right?
partner in that.
Yeah, they're both guys representing the left parties of their respective nations, but they're both sort of pushing the same oriented pro-globalist war-making program that saw an explosion in the Middle East, inside jobs galore, inside jobs in the UK as well as in the US, that justified more security state clampdowns. And then now you got Obama as came into power as an anti-war president, clearly expanded war in Libya and drone kills and everything else. And then Hillary, and then like, where are the actual Democrats at this point? It's like they all got pushed so far to Hobbes, to the Hobbesian worldview, that it's very difficult to find them. Maybe a little bit with Sanders, but even Sanders, he's compromised on a million levels. So I think that there might be something within the conservative parties. Most of the people who read my material tend to be conservative. And I think that there's something within the constituency that tends to be conservative, which has within them a moral culture. They tend to be, more religious, more inclined to believe in God, even though they've got all sorts of quacky, abstract ideas of, Austrian school economics that they think they have to embrace, that have at the root a love of freedom, ultimately. So it's a good ideal that we love freedom. Thus we are endorsing the Austrian school of libertarianism. I don't know how that necessarily extends itself, but there's something true there. And they have a moral principle of judging right and wrong, that they believe in such a thing as right and wrong. which is not conducive to the type of system that this oligarchy wants to bring into the world, as far as a culture that is incapable of passing judgment of right and wrong. So one of the key things that the oligarchy did when they created the Theosophists, at the same time as they were creating the Fabians and these other think tanks, was to create a new type of culture that would destroy people's ability to judge that anything was right or wrong, and without the ability to use discernment, because you have no internal standards that you believe in, you will sort of adapt to anything that is created for you to adapt to that can be normalized, right? So the Frankfurt School takeover of our education system, and a lot of this again came in with John Dewey, who himself was a leader of the American branch of the Fabian Society. He was himself mentored by William James, who was also, in 19th century father of modern education and psychology, was very, very closely aligned. He was actually the founder of the American branch of the British Society for Psychical Research, to try to sort of provide a scientific base to justify or normalize paranormal phenomenon of ghosts and, telepathy and seeing spirits and channeling. Modern oracles of the cult of Delphi, basically, is what they're trying to revive as far as, and give it some scientific veneer. So William James was part of that. Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-discovered Darwin's theory, was a founding member of that thing. And so was Sir William Crookes, who became president of the British Royal Society. There's a lot of these creatures who, again, brought this society, and again, the Society for Psychical Research plays into the Fabian Society, Theosophists, Roundtable Movement, nexus very, very much so. And the idea was to create both to shape a new religious matrix for the world, like a new one world religion, which was the founding drive of the Theosophists, as well as a new accompanying complementary science based upon purely statistical probability theory. So to reduce the entirety of the universe and its different manifestations, biology, human society, economics, climate science, atomic science, everything, reduce everything to the language of statistical mathematical probability theory. And thus, you can't say in this type of matrix that was promoted by Rockefeller-funded groups like Niels Bohr, who founded the Copenhagen interpretation of the atom, or their cosmological extrapolations within the astrophysics realms that were also extending certain principles of entropy that were, observable within mechanical systems. Any type of closed thermodynamic system is entropic. It'll always wind down. It'll always use up more energy than it creates. So it's thus always going to be destined by some predetermined heat death in whether it's a gas engine or a flame or our bodies. But they extended that thing, that empirically observable phenomenon, to the entirety of the universe. And they then redefined what were all of the mechanisms presumed to shape the behavior of suns, of moons, of planets, of other stars, of whole galaxies, around the idea that everything is like a giant closed system gas engine with an external boundary condition outside of which there is no universe. Hence, this is Big Bang cosmology that came out of a certain type of reading or interpretation of the Doppler or the redshift. And they thus presume that everything is thus predetermined to die into some preordained heat death, at which the normal state of stasis of nothing changing is going to come back to normal forever. So all of this was done to create, I think, a metaphysical cage around the minds of people, and a set of rules associated with that cage that we were told we have to live and adapt within and play by these rules that apply to the atom, that apply to macrocosm, to life, to everything. And it was all tied to these Fabians and their different branches. That were all, if everything is probability theory, then you can't prove that I can't run through a wall, let's say, that my particles can't just align by some statistical, improbable but possible, scenario to run through a wall, or that I can't, you could talk to somebody who, I've had debates. Maybe you have too. I don't know, but I've had debates with people who really are ideologues about this radical quantum interpretation, where I've asked them, like, you're saying everything is possible, that there's all sorts of infinite possible parallel universes that were needed to explain the Big Bang. So everything exists in another universe if it doesn't exist in our particular universe. So if everything exists, then nothing exists, right? If everything is true, then nothing is true. And then you can't even say why I can't turn into a purple hippopotamus and fly through my window, because maybe that's just where my particles are going to want to align to. And they will not be able to say that is impossible. There is an intellectual referee, an electric fence around their minds that don't allow them to say that something is impossible or is wrong. They cannot say that I am wrong. They could say that they don't like what I'm saying, that it's improbable, but they can't say it. And because they can't judge right and wrong, they can't judge gender. You can't judge that there's not, 80,000 different genders or whatever I feel becomes a truth. So this is the type of radical empiricism that is then extrapolated into generalities and laws of nature and economics that people like Bertrand Russell were supporting when this Fabian Society guy, as a eugenicist, was saying, oh, I love freedom and I love love and I love anarchism, which he promoted in his books too. He's saying like anarcho-syndicalism is like the best thing ever, but it has to be, managed by a world government under the League of Nations where there's no sovereignty of the people to make their decisions. But it's like, how do you coexist with these seemingly different sentiments? And it's because they're not honest. They have an inner belief that they won't say aloud because it's sick and disgusting and people will fight it. And then they have this outward thing. They use a different kind of logic for the plebes to be seduced by their charming words. And whether it's the von Hayeks out there or the Keynesians or whomever, they've got an inner esoteric belief for the inner initiates, which is sick, genocidal, and disgusting. And then you got an exoteric external belief for the non-initiates, whether it's of the theosophists or whatever, who are supposed to have a big kumbaya and hug each other and like have some utopian fantasy world that'll come into being. So anyway, I think that's what's happening to all of our different governments, is that the Blairites, and Blair doesn't believe, he says he's a Catholic.
I know.
And then they put him up into debating like actual atheists like Dawkins or whoever, and they make these big public debates that Blair is going to represent Christianity in this debate against like an atheist, and of course he's going to lose, of course. And it's designed to destroy people who have like weaker minds. And what little faith, if they were on the fence about it, is there a God? Is there good in Christianity? If they were on the fence and they watch that debate, they're now going to become pro-Dawkins atheists.
Well, I mean, it's just another club for me. Anyway, it's membership in another cult or another club. and I'm not, I have an issue with religion. I don't have an issue with faith. Yeah. I live in a country where faith is prevalent everywhere you go. It's part of people's consciousness without them even being aware of it. But they might put a label on it, but they don't need religion per se, which I always look at as being man-made, to practice that faith, because that faith is unbreakable, But in the West, we've had the faith eroded. And what's left, in my view, are clubs and cults.
Yeah.
And if you belong to one cult, you denigrate the other, and so on. And as you said, that's this part of this kind of metaphysical entrapment of the mind and limiting of the mind. That's my opinion,
Yeah. I think it's well said. Well said.
So it's kind of interesting, and so when he made that move, I never saw it as a heartfelt, genuine, spiritual awakening, because I think the guy's in, I think it's impossible for him to have that. He wouldn't be who he is now if there had been any genuine, because you need humility to be able to awaken to anything, let's say on a higher dimension, right? To the one where Blair is operating.
I believe he might be authentically religious. I just don't think that the God he believes control the world and that he's devoted to is the God that you that he's
exactly, yes.
in the Bible.
Exactly. Or as I said, the God that walks among us here, where really it's about being the best human being you can to other human beings.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's a completely different paradigm to the one that people like Blair operate in, or Trudeau, or Trump, Biden, any of them.
We're opening up a whole.
I know.
This would be a great conversation for another podcast.
I think we're gonna kind of.
I'm thinking like everything I could possibly say right now towards what you just said is like a whole other like can of worms. That's a fun journey to take, but maybe we should.
I think we should make that part 2, maybe.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do a follow up on religion and spirituality.
Yeah, definitely. Because as I said, I don't consider myself a religious person, but I do consider myself someone that has absorbed a variety of I'm trying to think of how to describe this. I guess doctrines by which I try to live my life, whether they're moral principles, whatever. And I think for me that's what spirituality should be about. It should be about your personal relationship with the higher power and the higher self, of course.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We're all capable of elevating our psyche, and of course that's what all of this. I love your idea of a metaphysical cage around our brains. And I remember speaking to a friend of mine that was kind of she studied brain science, and she pointed out. I mean, I don't think she would have made the connections that you have tonight. And she pointed out the fact that I think it's the frontal lobe that is connected into intuition and the ability to read situations. And that has been, it's like it's been atrophied, right? But by the environment in which we're living, right? So that ability to think for ourselves, to form judgments, to actually have trust in our intuition and our reading of a situation is what is being and has been eroded for years.
Does she mean that there's like evidence of a physiological atrophying of the brain within these types of cultures?
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, it's interesting. I'd like to see that.
Of the brain that is actually responsible for all of these sort of more metaphysical exercises of the brain. Yes.
That makes sense. Like there's definitely solid evidence of what's a fancy name for psychophysical parallelism or something. But yeah, like that there's this measurable physical chemical electro behavior in different parts of the brain according to certain sets of thoughts that we have. So the metaphysical ideas that we develop and engage upon will express themselves. It's not just like, okay, you have a thought based on what a piece of music you just heard that activates an auditory part of the brain, or you've seen something that I see a cup, I have an idea of a cup, but I've seen it visually, so it's the visual cortex. It's not just that. There's this higher metaphysical realm that has its own geometry of expression within the brain, so thus certain higher ordering ideas would thus have some sort of physical corollary, and lower order ideas would have another physical corollary. I could see that making a lot of sense. So in a society that doesn't that people are not given access to or are deprived of developing or awakening those higher ideas, that part of the brain would, it makes sense that would be a dormant part of the brain. That's interesting. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it was quite fascinating. I mean, that was quite a few years ago that we had that conversation. Yeah. Anyway, the conversation is kind of veered off in a slightly different direction, but that always seems to happen with us.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's good. It's good.
Let's do a part 2 and go into this idea of, religion and spirituality and the control aspect of it, because I definitely towards seeing religion very much as a control construct.
Yeah. Well, they're definitely bringing the Crusader brand of like Christianity into play again, and there's and that's expected, as a reaction to the woke absurdity of total atheistic, like hyper liberal garbage of the Frankfurt School. Of course, every time you go to one extreme, you're going to awaken a reaction to the opposite extreme. So there is like a stage being set for a hard right, which involves all sorts of reactivations of the worst destructive elements of Christianity. That's clearly being set. So totally, unpack what were the days of what's good religion versus this other thing that the oligarchy wants when Blair supports Christianity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Matt, so much. That was, like, as always, a fascinating journey, and I hope people enjoy it as much as I did. Can you before you go, just let people know where they can find your work and Cynthia's work as well, which is incredibly important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. And I hope people do appreciate and got some edification out of some of the ideas we're throwing around. Cynthia's work is just incredible. And I was in preparation for today's show, I reviewed a chapter in her book, The Empire in Which the Sun Never Set. The Empire in Which the Black Sun of the Occult Never Set, which is called From Trotskyism to Radical Positivism, How Albert Wohlstetter Became the Leading Authority on Nuclear Strategy for America, which goes into a wonderful deep dive onto a lot of the elements of what I was talking about today, of the Fabian Society and its transformations and rebrandings throughout the 20th century. Really good stuff. So her work and her book is available on her Substack, cynthiachung.substack.com, as well as risingtidefoundation.net, she's the president of this nonprofit we created. And my books on the Clash of the Two Americas and the Untold History of Canada and Science Unshackled, that's on I guess my Substack, matthewehret.substack.com is one way to find them, or canadianpatriot.org is another pretty easy way to find those books, and contact me if people want to know more.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much, Matt. Really enjoyed it. Thank you for your time. And let's line up a part 2.
All right.
Possible.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd look forward to that. Okay, cool. Talk to you later.
Bye.